The Americans had been in Vietnam long enough to know that when monsoon season hit, the rules of the game changed. For months, rain grounded aircraft and turned roads into rivers of mud. Only one group could still strike through the Mekong Delta's drowned arteries: the gunboats of the Mobile Riverine Force. Armored troop carriers pushed forward through the narrow waterways, their hulls packed to the brim with platoon infantry and M113 armored vehicles. Decks bristled with .50 caliber machine guns and flamethrowers, ready to incinerate any Viet Cong bunker they found along the way. But in Vietnam, the enemy wasn't the only threat. The very river turned against them in an instant. The water narrowed and shallowed until the force's boats could barely move. America's last amphibious weapon was now compromised. Yet sailors refused to surrender. The Mobile Riverine Force always pushed forward, even if it had to fight against the Delta itself. USS Harnett County cut through the blue waters of the Pacific. 20 years earlier, she'd steamed these very seas to witness the fall of Imperial Japan. Now, armed with 40 limiter cannons and crowned with a helicopter landing pad, she was out of retirement and tasked with a new mission: forcing yet another Asian enemy into submission before it was too late. 2 years into America's campaign in Vietnam, the war's end was nowhere in sight. Bombs rained down in the north, but the communists refused to break. In the south, American troops plunged into dense jungles that seemed to swallow them whole. The Viet Cong were everywhere, burrowed into tunnels, hidden in villages, crouched behind every shadowed tree line, waiting for the right moment to pounce. It was time for the U.S. Navy to unleash an all-out approach. However, as Harnett County reached Vietnam shore, she had to stop. There was only so far she could go before the shallow waters dragged her hull into the mud and left her stranded. In order to continue their journey, personnel left Harnett County's decks and jumped into patrol boat rivers, or PBRs, leaving their mothership behind. At barely 30 feet long, these boats seemed almost like mosquitoes when compared to the rest of the Navy's fleet. Yet they were the only ones capable of slipping into the narrow canals of the Mekong Delta, navigating across a labyrinth of muddy rivers, overgrown canals, and whispering mangroves. It was far from an ideal situation, yet it was the only way to sail into the Viet Cong strongholds. The men on board the riverboats would come to form the Mobile Riverine Force, or MRF, a joint strike unit tasked with patrolling and securing more than 5,000 miles of waterways, serving as streets for the locals. While the Navy piloted the craft, Army troops rode alongside, ready to disembark and sweep through the jungle on foot if needed. When they first started their patrols, the banks were quiet, and at moments they could even seem peaceful. Yet not a single American on the Riverine Force ever let their rifles drop. Every boat they passed was a potential threat that could conceal hidden enemies, transporting an arsenal of weapons. The patrols had to stop every vessel, no matter how inconspicuous it seemed, interrogating every passenger as they searched for hidden weapons and explosives beneath baskets of fruit or sacks of grain. For weeks, communist forces had been watching from a distance, exploiting gaps in the American river patrol patterns, silently massing near the South Vietnamese city of Mai To, awaiting the right moment to attack American positions. The U.S. patrol boats were vulnerable, moving at slow speeds as engines churned against the current in the open, with nowhere to hide or maneuver. If the Viet Cong were to have the first strike through an ambush from the banks, or by deploying faster sampans loaded with explosives and gunmen, the Americans would be sitting ducks. But before the Viet Cong offensive could be launched, intelligence came through, alerting the Americans about the location where the Viet Cong were believed to be hiding. There was no time for confirmation. Patrol units in the area were told to abandon their current missions and turn their hulls toward the suspected stronghold. However, even when briefed about the enemy's hideout, it wasn't easy for troops to spot the Viet Cong while sailing across the murky brown waterways, flanked by miles of endless jungle. For hours, they scanned every turn, catching every glint of movement behind the reeds. The larger vessels stationed by the shore couldn't come down to support the operation, yet they launched assault helicopters from their decks, deployed to help hunt for signs of movement in the trees below. Additional support for the patrol boat was provided by South Vietnamese ground troops, tasked with clearing suspected enemy zones on foot, following the Navy's slow advance through the river in hopes of conducting an attack from both flanks. While these rangers pushed through the tangled underbrush, one of the soldiers suddenly spotted a shadow darting between the trees. As he carefully approached, a single shot cracked, missing him by inches. The rest of the troops couldn't identify where the bullet had come from before a burst of gunfire began to rain their way. The Viet Cong had opened fire. Back at the river, the boats got the warning too late. Shells erupted from the banks, rounds skipping across the water like stones. Patrol boats responded in kind, unleashing fire from machine guns against the tree line, hammering enemy positions as Viet Cong fighters melted back into the foliage. For a moment, the canal felt silent, but the members of the Mobile Riverine Force did not dare to breathe. They knew the second round was coming. Without missing a beat, the MRF got into battle formation. Their boats may have been small, but what they lacked in size, they made up for in strength. Each assault group was composed of dozens of armored troop carriers, or tangos, their decks lined with 50 caliber machine guns, their hulls stretching wide enough to carry an M113 armored personnel carrier, or nearly 40 infantrymen packed shoulder to shoulder, ready to storm the banks. Alongside them moved monitors, floating gunships with 81mm mortars mounted like cannons, ready to spit round after round into the tree line. Fast assault boats darted just behind, grenade launchers cocked and ready, while refueler craft ensured the flotilla could keep fighting for days without needing to return to base. The boats opened fire, gun barrels lit up the river as they rained down upon the suspected Viet Cong positions. Suddenly, from the jungle emerged a B-40 rocket, followed by blasts from 57mm recoilless rifles. One rocket slammed into a tango, shaking its entire steel hull and sending shockwaves across the water. Shrapnel sliced through the air. Several soldiers were thrown to the deck, wounded by the hail of metal. But the boat held. Rattled, but still afloat, its gunners refused to stop firing, spraying the jungle blindly, hoping to hit something in the mass of green ahead. The firefight blazed on until the river fell silent once again. Smoke clung to the surface of the water, and only the low hum of boat engines remained. Determined not to let the enemy escape, American and South Vietnamese troops moved swiftly. Boats cut off river exits, while infantry stormed the banks, fanning out toward nearby villages. But before they could secure the region, the attackers came back at night, going after the Allied forces. Radios crackled as commanders debated whether to continue the operation, until eventually the call was made to halt further offensive movement. By the time the operation had concluded, the Americans had confirmed that at least 83 Viet Cong fighters and operatives had been identified and detained, and several fortified positions had been destroyed. However, the lives of 10 U.S. soldiers had been lost, alongside at least 28 Vietnamese fighters. Dozens more were wounded, many limping back to the boats with their feet blistered and raw from wading through waist-deep muck for hours on end. Yet the Mobile Riverine Force had no choice but to keep going. In Vietnam, for nearly half the year, thick curtains of rain fell across the Mekong Delta like a veil, and thunderclouds roared above for months on end, grounding aircraft, blinding surveillance, and turning roads into rivers of mud. Any attempt to carry out a ground operation during this time was pure hell. Armored vehicles bogged down, and infantry struggled with each step as they fought to break through the mud. The enemy took full advantage of the Americans' stifled air and land mobility to rebuild shattered bunkers, rearm hidden caches, and tighten their grip over old strongholds thought to have been cleared. The Mobile Riverine Force could not sit still while this went on. Amid the month-long storms, the MRF was one of the few Allied forces still capable of keeping their operations rolling, cutting through the swollen waterways and serving as a mobile strike platform to keep the Viet Cong in check. And so, as the monsoon season arrived in mid-1967, Riverine patrols launched a series of missions across Delta territory, later known as Operation Coronado. At first, boat patrol commanders were bound to run into the same massacres as the ones they'd faced earlier in the year. However, far from running into ambushes, the MRF forces gradually started to become masters of the river. Troops began to move with increasing confidence, threading through the Delta as if they'd grown up in its swamps. Enemy fire slackened, and more prisoners were taken without losing American personnel. River warfare was finally giving the U.S. the edge it so desperately needed. In August, new intelligence reached the Mobile Riverine base. Another enemy buildup was forming about 30 miles away from their anchorage. The boats darted across the river, but as they neared the reported site, the Mekong betrayed them. The waters narrowed and shallowed, clogged with silt, and too treacherous even for their shallow draft craft. The boats couldn't keep going. They'd have to walk. After hours of marching through shallow water and mud-choked trails, the American infantry finally caught a flicker of movement ahead. Peeking through the tangled palms and reeds stood a Viet Cong stronghold, half submerged in jungle shadow. It wasn't heavily defended. The enemy likely never expected U.S. forces to make it this far into the Delta during the heart of monsoon season. It was the perfect opportunity. As silently as possible, the troops crept closer until they were within striking distance. Then, with a sudden thunder of gunfire, they opened up. Bullets tore through the water, punching into the encampment as stunned Viet Cong scrambled in confusion. Caught off guard, the enemy stumbled against themselves as they fled into the jungle. With their river gunboat stuck too far behind, the troops called in the only support fast enough to catch the fleeing guerrillas. Choppers roared overhead. Soldiers piled in and were airlifted over the treetops, eyes scanning below for signs of movement. As the helicopters reached the suspected hiding spots, sniper fire cracked from the tree line, forcing pilots to veer and dip to avoid being hit. From the side doors, gunners and infantry fired down into the green maze below, machine guns roaring, grenades bursting, and tracer rounds carving glowing arcs through the mist. Amid the chaos, some helicopters dipped too low, skimming the surface of the river in search of targets, only to be nearly hit by friendly fire as units mistook movement for enemy positions. Pilots had to pull back. Some were damaged, while others were nearly brought down to the waters beneath them. 6 men from the Mobile Riverine Force were wounded. Still, the fight raged on, until finally, the enemy guns fell silent. When the smoke cleared and the gunships pulled away, American troops cautiously came back down to the edges of the delta. At first, it seemed like the Viet Cong had slipped away once more into the jungle mist. But then they spotted a body. The documents he carried with him marked him as part of the 506th Local Force Battalion. Then another fallen Viet Cong, and another. By the time the tally was complete, nearly 60 enemy fighters had been eliminated. The Delta, once a Viet Cong stronghold, was now America's domain. With their newfound sense of dominance over the Mekong, the Mobile Riverine Force readied itself for the next blow in the Coronado Campaign, Operation Coronado 5, launched in September 1967. The objective seemed simple on paper. Insert American and South Vietnamese battalions near suspected hiding grounds of the Viet Cong's 263rd Main Force Battalion and expel the enemy from the area for good. However, the terrain was treacherous, and the narrow waterways prevented the Mobile Riverine unit from deploying most of their craft into the area. Waves of infantry and M113 armored personnel carriers were forced to push through the mud, collapsing trails, and vine-choked ditches across the Vietnamese forest. Luckily for them, they didn't have to go too far. Not long into their advance, American troops stumbled onto the Viet Cong's rear guard. It was a familiar scene, with the Viet Cong trying to scatter the moment they were caught. As they made their way into rice paddies, helicopters descended, carrying squads of ARVN paratroopers who immediately began to spit tracers as the enemy ran for cover. American Army carriers and infantry closed in, unleashing torrents of .50 caliber fire, grenades, and mortars. Dozens of Viet Cong fighters collapsed where they stood, pinned between the rivers and the jungle, with nowhere left to run. But the victory was incomplete. Many fighters had vanished into the foliage, slipping away before the Americans could get to them. U.S. commanders suspected that the survivors may have made their way to one of the largest strongholds in the region, located near the Kam Son River. It was said that this was the place where the feared Viet Cong 514th Battalion used to regroup before their next assault. The Americans had to eradicate the hotspot, and once again, the Mobile Riverine Force was leading the strike. A flotilla of ATCs was deployed to the area. As they crawled through the currents, the team had to pass a curved stretch of the river known as Snoopy's Nose. If the enemy learned about their approach, the entire operation could be compromised, so helicopters flying overhead were reduced to a minimum, and artillery was ordered to halt in order to soften the approach. Every man remained silent as the boats glided across the curve. The enemy territory seemed to be just within reach. Then chaos erupted. From both sides of the river, Viet Cong rockets screamed out of the tree line, followed by the deafening sound of automatic gunfire. Water erupted as bullets punched into it. Boats spun to avoid collisions. Some tried to push forward, others veered back. Fire teams on board let loose with machine guns, grenade launchers, and mortars, but the visibility was near zero. Organized communication broke down almost instantly. There was no time for coordination, no channel open for warning nearby patrols. Boats kept surging forward, unaware they were heading straight into a kill zone. Those who dodged the incoming gunfire barely had time to react before the river beneath them erupted as Viet Cong mines detonated with deafening blasts. With the river closing, the order came down to fall back. One by one, the damaged boats peeled away. Nearly half the flotilla had taken hits. More than 80 men were wounded. But the Mobile Riverine Force wasn't about to surrender the Mekong. Once out of the direct line of fire, the surviving craft were patched, rearmed, and sent back into the inferno just hours later. This time, as the lead boats edged around Snoopy's nose, they were ready. The moment the jungle lit up with gunfire, the boats answered with everything they had. Gunships above rained down support, unleashing storms of tracers that punched through the gauntlet and secured their landing zones. Once ashore, the Americans released their final strike. For the next couple of days, they unleashed a series of aerial and ground attacks to wipe out all Viet Cong hideouts in the area. By the time the operation concluded, over 200 Viet Cong were gone, yet the Americans had only lost 16 of their own. The Mobile Riverine Force had won the day. But deep down, the men aboard the boats knew. The Viet Cong were learning fast, and if U.S. forces stumbled again, it would be a matter of time before the enemy reclaimed the rivers. In the months following the near-fatal ambush at Snoopy's nose, American riverine forces set out to clean house. Steel-hulled patrol boats, armored troop carriers, and monitors cut through the Mekong Delta once more, set to eradicate every last Viet Cong stronghold lurking along the rivers and canals. As the monsoon rains finally began to fade, visibility improved, and the crews aboard the boats could get a glimpse of the shattered contours of hidden bunkers, sunken sampans, and crude river barricades. With helicopter gunships circling above, the boats pushed in closer to shore, executing amphibious landings as soldiers kept their eyes on the tree line and fingers on the trigger. While rockets hissed out of the underbrush and ATCs were hammered with shrapnel and bullets, the boats charged headlong, weaving through fire, veering hard toward the jungle's edge, flanking the attackers and encircling them before they could slip away. For particularly contested landings, the MRF had packed a new set of weapons: mounted flamethrowers, their cannons spitting fire across the riverbank and sending enemies fleeing. Dozens of strongholds were overrun, and by mid-January, over 400 enemy fighters had been eliminated. Gradually, a sense of peace slowly began to return to the Delta, and by early 1968, weapons were lowered, if only for a moment. The enemy had been expelled, and now the troops deserved a moment to rest and celebrate. South Vietnamese allies who had fought alongside the Americans began returning to their home provinces to celebrate the Lunar New Year, or Tet, a date unofficially recognized as a ceasefire from both sides. However, on the eve of Tet, as fireworks began to crackle in cities all across South Vietnam, American soldiers began to look at each other in confusion upon realizing that the sound of explosions wasn't just coming from the sky. Before U.S. troops could grab onto their weapons, they were already under fire. The Viet Cong had come back for revenge once more. The Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam like wildfire. Major cities were infiltrated. Provincial capitals crumbled. In Mai To, even President Nguyen Van Thieu found himself trapped in his own home as VC sappers fanned across the region, seizing control of key locations and military personnel with terrifying speed. As this nationwide invasion was taking place across South Vietnam, the armored boats of the Mobile Riverine Force remained on alert, conducting routine radar sweeps along the banks of the Mekong Delta. Then, from every radio, on every boat, the same message began to arrive. All units were needed at once, and they were needed everywhere. This time, however, the Riverine Force wasn't told to head out into jungle clearings, but straight into contested urban war zones. The boats had never carried out a mission like this before, but they could not refuse the call. Armored troop carriers dove straight toward the cities, while helicopters thundered overhead, dropping infantry into the heart of contested streets. Infantry stormed through alleyways and courtyards, howitzers and machine guns spitting fire into every enemy stronghold they found along the way. The battle was never-ending, with troops having to clear street by street and then jumping back onto boats, soaked in sweat, smoke, and blood, just to be immediately redeployed to the next city. After weeks of combat, the fighting had become unsustainable. The Viet Cong refused to break, slipping through American encirclements and regrouping in the undergrowth. The Mobile Riverine Force knew the only way to end the bloodshed was to land one final devastating blow. On February 6th, before dawn, a reinforced company climbed aboard a column of armored troop carriers and slipped into the canal surrounding the city of Bin Long. The Americans divided their forces, with two separate companies launching from opposite flanks. Once ashore, they drive inwards, encircling the enemy. Among the men was a young soldier, Specialist Thomas James Kinsman. Inside an ATC, he braced as the boat surged forward, and suddenly gunfire erupted from the jungle. Bullets tore into the water around them. The crew dropped flat, hugging the deck. The captain hunched behind armor plating, urging the craft forward at full throttle, zigzagging through the canal's choke points. The moment the ramp dropped, Kinsman and his unit spilled into the mud. Dense undergrowth choked their vision, and troopers lost sight of one another in seconds. Still, Kinsman pressed forward. Weapon ready, heart pounding, eyes scanning every shadow. Around him, his men advanced in scattered formation. Suddenly, a grenade arced through the air, landing with a thud directly ahead of the advancing squad. Kinsman didn't hesitate. He shouted for his comrades to get down, then threw himself on the grenade. The explosion tore through his chest and limbs, but his body absorbed the blast, shielding the men behind him. He lived, barely, but his sacrifice had saved the entire fire team. Determined to avenge their comrade, the Americans surged forward with fury. The rest of the platoon arrived, guns blazing as they swept the area. Flanking units closed in, while riverine boats shelled nearby tree lines, sealing off the enemy's escape routes. But as darkness fell, the jungle grew silent. The Viet Cong had vanished yet again. In the following months, the Mobile Riverine Force continued to push deeper into the waterways of South Vietnam. Over 600 miles of river were patrolled and secured, with numerous enemy strongholds shattered, battalions scattered, and by summer's height, nearly 700 enemy fighters neutralized during clashes along the canals. No matter how far the MRF sailed, or how many jungle firefights they won, the enemy never stayed gone for long. The Viet Cong had mastered the art of dodging American offensives, slipping into civilian crowds, or disappearing upriver, only to regroup and strike again a week later. Fresh offensives erupted across South Vietnam, and towns once thought secure were assaulted anew. Thousands of American lives were lost, and no clear victory was in sight. In 1973, after nearly a decade of river patrols across the Delta, the United States began to withdraw. The boats were decommissioned, and their crews sent home with their mission still unfinished. Just 2 years later, North Vietnamese forces marched into Saigon. The South collapsed, and the Mekong Delta, once guarded by the most daring flotilla the war had seen, fell into enemy hands. Everything the Mobile Riverine Force had fought so fiercely to hold was lost.